This is actually a project that we're working on, a research project for our book. I think Joe and I agree that if we can use a movement, the movement of people who have been involved in groups have come up with a great body of knowledge on recovery, strategies, ways of looking at people's experience. But there are, I believe, obstacles for people entering or accessing the body of knowledge.
Yes.
And the question I have is always around this term cult, which I think is a very useful term for some people some of the time. So I'm working with University of Madrid. We're just almost finished up an instrument, and we're going to put it out in social media to determine the usefulness of this term. What term, the questions are related around what term did you use to describe your experience when you left? And what time do you do now? Let's assuming that there's some period of time, but the instrument will determine the length of time. And we were interested in how does someone internally describe their experience themselves, their internal dialogue, and externally to other people. And so we've come up with about 70 possible terms, and people are adding to them. And it turns out, like I described my experience that I went to a Hindu university. Joe says he lives in an ashram. Somebody else I know said they were in the group, they were in this thing called an experiment. But they don't use the word cult, and cult, they just don't identify it in that way. So it can be for some people an obstacle for entering in and accessing this information. And that's what I'm interested in finding out.
And the parallels that I've seen in 12-step meetings, those individuals who go to a 12-step meeting, 15% of the people who engage with 12 steps successfully complete the program and stay sober. But that means 85% don't. And it's looked at as the golden standard that people should, once you get involved in a 12-step program, you'll automatically be cured of your alcoholism or addiction. And we know scientifically that's just not the case. So likewise, in cultic groups, once they stand up and say, I'm an alcoholic, I've acknowledged the problem, that's a huge part of the solution. I'm a cult member. Is it the same? Are we trying to kind of shroud people or label people or require of them that they identify as an ex-cult member in order for them to get the proper help?
In developing this instrument, I was struggling with this. I mean, I just had theoretically, I think maybe 50% of people do, 50% don't. That's just a made-up number. But I was looking at studying many different Facebook groups where people left groups that were, from my perspective, I think we might agree, cultic.
Yeah, cultic is an okay word. Cult isn't.
Yeah, so they were cultic, and yet they don't describe it that way. They describe it as their denomination or the church they were involved in. And I recall going to Wellspring one time. I brought somebody to the rehab center, and sitting around, they were around the dining room table, and all these former members of different Christian groups were not saying the word cult. They would say, when I was in my church. So it was an obstacle for some people.
And they described it as spiritual abuse instead of cultic abuse.
Yeah.
I found that interesting, and I attended a conference recently that brought it home to me. I've been in this network for 30 some odd years, of first Cult Awareness Network and now ICSA and others. And people don't use that term coming out of Christian churches, generally cult. They use a spiritual abuse environment or cultic or damaging church.
And the abuse is often very far from being spiritual in nature. It's often very physical in nature.
This is true.
Yeah.
So
not to be forgotten.
Looking at the development of this instrument was with Carmen Almendrez at the University of Madrid. We were looking at terms, and we were especially looking at terms relating to people in multi-level marketing groups. And what do they call it? So let's, instead of naming a group, we'll call it the vitamins method. We'll make up a name of a multi-level marketing. And she said, we have to add to this, these few questions, things that indicate abuse. So she's taking some questions from the psychological abuse scale, because someone could have been involved in a multi-level marketing and be taken advantage of, but they weren't psychologically abused. And then there's those who are in a multi-level marketing that were psychologically abused. And that's the population that I think the resources that this sort of movement we come from, have to offer. Maybe not necessarily to the people who just got involved in X multi-level marketing, spent $150 or $300 on product and moved on. That's one group of people. And then there's those who devoted their life to it. And that's a different standard. So the questions are relating to both of these things. And I'm very interested in finding out what terms do people use to describe their experience, so that we can have other ways in, and then what models are useful. And so I would use the word concepts are useful. And I know that Joe and I, in our work working with people in groups, we do a thorough assessment of a case, of a situation, and we look at these models that exist, Lifton, Singer, whatever, there's a whole bunch of them. And then we look at, from the group point of view, what has the group done with those concepts? So some groups have armed their members against the word cult. So maybe that's not a helpful term. And then from the members' point of view.
And then there's those groups that say, we are a cult.
Yeah.
Own it.
and then from the family's point of view. So we tried to do an analysis or an assessment to find what concepts, or this whole basket of concepts, which ones can we pick and choose that are most likely to help someone move along, rather than saying that this one model fits everyone.
Yeah,
that's what we're playing with.
Some decades ago, I had the great good fortune to meet a guy who was a linguist and a philologist, and a friend of his who'd been at university with him had become involved in Scientology, and he came to talk to me, and he explained to me a simple concept in language, which is the per word and the snarl word. So the word fascist for most of us is a snarl word.
Mm-hmm.
The word democracy for most of us is a per word. A word like appeasement, which means negotiating an agreement, has become a snarl word. And what happened in the 70s, so when I left Scientology in 83, I don't think I'd have been too bothered about the word cult. I was still with the Oxford Dictionary definition, which meant a devotion, not even an excessive devotion, but a devotion to an idea or a person. And that was it. It's actually registered in 1711 as the first usage in that meaning. And there was no new meaning in the Oxford Dictionary until the 1980s. However, the American Heritage Dictionary in the 1890s had started to put a pejorative spin on this word cult. And then, of course, we got the huge media thing. And it's kind of the word sect, as now Brian Wilson, who was the bane of anybody that's trying to deal with this problem, this Cambridge, I think, sociologist, who put forward the idea of the new religious movement, he and Gordon Melton. He said, well, we're going to politely call these groups sects. Now, because that falls over, because in mainland Europe, the word sect means cult.
Yes.
That word's moved on. So for me, it was sort of, what is it, we have high demand, high control groups. What is it that I actually object to, that I can say, this group does this? And for me, that's very simple, that we have what in Hong Kong is now being called pro-democracy, the idea that we should all have a say in affairs, which I think is written into the Constitution of the United States. And at the other end, we have anti-authoritarian. And that when I look at these groups, what I object to is nothing, and the word totalitarian's used, I think it's excessive, because these groups are not necessarily totalitarian.
Right.
Authoritarian, telling you what you ought to think and you ought to believe.
That's right.
I'll give you one example of this. One of the many elections that has happened in Israel over the last few years, a young woman was questioned as she came out of the polling booth who she'd voted for, and she said, I voted for Netanyahu. And then she was asked, why did you vote for him? And she said, because my rabbi told me to. Now, that's authoritarianism. That's not democracy. And for me, pulling those two things apart, and I have a friend who, when somebody comes to her, is quite evidently dealing, in a relationship with a malignant narcissist. She doesn't say, is your husband a psychopath? she says, do you live with a difficult person?
Yeah.
And it's finding, so I agree with you completely that it's finding a language that doesn't snarl at people and that allows them to talk about their experience. The other part is the exclusivity, that my group is different to your group. So your group, the Moon is TM. I knew they were cults and destructive. And it's, do people ever need to say I was a victim? When that word has become so loaded, certainly for Scientologists, it's completely loaded that you're never meant to say that.
That word of that sense of being a victim is really abhorrent for many people who come out in the beginning. And I was reading an article recently of a young woman. She had to be, she was born and raised in Unificationism, and she was an excellent dancer. She came from Malaysia. And the article really fascinated me because it dealt with just this issue. And that is, I will never call my experience cultic, but I want to have nothing to do with it. It was an abusive system. And but that word, CULT word, was not something that she could settle with.
Yeah.
Because that definition included horns, not literally, a tail, and a certain red coloring. So it seemed extreme to her to identify her growing up as a cult. Yet we know many second gen folks and multi-gen folks, multi-generational and second gen. For those who don't understand what I'm saying, I'm speaking jargon here. Who need the word because they left their families. They separated from their culture. And, why did they do it? Well, where did we learn that what we were involved in was something, dangerous and harmful? It's this group that talks about cults. Therefore, we find comfort there. So we can understand both perspectives.
We asked a question at the University of Madrid at an ex-member workshop that Joe and I did many years ago. It was about 30 people in the room. I don't remember the exact number. And we started this particular hour-and-a-half session with a question. The question was, is the word cult necessary to describe your experience, or is it what Lifton would call a thought-terminating cliche? And the room divided in sort of about three sort of groups. There was those who just left their group or recently left their group. And it was very important to them because it was something that when they heard the term, it made sense of their experience. And then there was a few people that had been out a long time and they didn't find it was satisfying anymore. And then there were people in the middle. But I think at different times, these terms are helpful for people. And we have to respect that people evolve, they change, they look at their own identity in different ways at different times, and they have their own internal dialogue about these ideas. And those are some of the things that we're interested in looking at. Because I recall when I worked for the International Occultic Studies Association for 23 years, and at one conference in Philadelphia, I did a quick sort of survey based upon the attendance, what groups people were from. Either these meant ex-members or families were concerned about, what groups were represented. And at that particular conference, there was one person from the Unification Church. And yet there's probably millions of people of any group, like Scientology TM, the Moonies, maybe Children of God, Guru Maharaji. There's only a few really big movements that are the Way International that brought in people. And I'm just thinking, why are they not coming? And I interviewed a man who ran the indoctrination camps, still a member actually, and they worked overtime on teaching their members why they weren't a cult. And so that term, my theory is, for that group of people is an obstacle. And can we find other ways in to share what we've learned about the nature of groups, influence, control, and all of those things? So it's been an interesting adventure trying to figure this out.
So, John, your book, Opening Our Minds.
Yes.
When is it published? Is it out?
Well, there's a version of it in Kindle, but I will be updating that in the next week. And of course, anybody who buys on Kindle can get the updated version. As I say, basically what's happened is that in reading it out, I've realized there are a few trivial repetitions and errors. You know, this is actually for me the 19th draft, and I'm sick and tired of it. So it's taken a long time to actually get the interest back in the work, to say, like, I really need to. So specifically, I've just finished reading the last but one chapter and sort of gone, I need to talk a little bit more about the concept of narcissism, because I am not happy with what is generally accepted. Again, talking with Dan Shaw the other week, Dan and I agree absolutely, as far as I can tell on this. Craig Malkin, who's at Harvard Med School, wrote a very fine book, but he puts this scale in it from 0 to 10. He says at 0, you have what he calls an echoist, somebody who doesn't want any attention at all. They have no sense of self-worth. They don't want their birthday to be celebrated. They don't want to be looked at. Then at the other end, you have what he calls a narcissist, and that would be the malignant narcissist of Eric Fromm's. And then in the middle at 5, he's got this term healthy narcissism. I couldn't do anything with that. Then underneath his scale, he says this is actually a scale of how special people feel. And it made me go, I'm with Fromm. The word narcissist, which was actually introduced by Havelock Ellis and picked up by Freud, it doesn't mean somebody who has self-love. It means somebody who doesn't know how to love. And so they're not narcissists. They haven't fallen in love with themselves. They need adulation to exist. And that the scale, therefore, becomes a scale of self-worth, which has 3 different positions on it. One of them is what he's calling an echoist, which is somebody who feels unworthy and don't want attention. The other has got somebody who feels unworthy and does want attention, which is so-called narcissist. And then you've got people who've got a relatively healthy self-view, which means every now and then they feel they're an imposter and don't really know what they're, talking about thoroughly, which does happen to us all occasionally, if we are healthy narcissists. But nonetheless have a sense of worth in what they're doing and what they've done. So, and it may just take me those 2 paragraphs at the end of the chapter, but I now feel that that's very necessary, because I think the whole idea of narcissism it's become strange, and
it's become a pop term. It's almost like it came up again, maybe in reference to the former president of the United States. I don't know. But it seems to have. I mean,
Barack Obama here, or
my right-wing friends considered him to be.
This idea of these continuums or scales, I think that this is one of the concepts we're trying to bring up in this writing we're doing, that almost everything is on the scale. So you have anxiety disorder, you're anxious, and where is that point where it's an anxiety disorder? Everything is on a scale. And the tendency, I think, in writing books so that people can understand them, especially people who have not been in groups, is to make these concepts very tight and I don't want to say loose, but not this continuum. But to make them accurate, I think you have to make a continuum.
And I think you have to go a bit beyond that too. That if we look, it's like the lust to describe something as a cult. Let's look at the Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist revised, which is used as an instrument throughout the world. And he says, if you score from 0 to 4, you're normal. If you score from 4 to 30, you're a sociopath. And if you score from 30 to 40, you're a psychopath. And I say, well, the wood and the trees. Here we have a forest, and it's got 17 different kinds of trees in it. And if 13 of them are present, it's a forest. And I'm saying what's useful to me in defining somebody is not saying, well, they're a paranoid schizophrenic. It's saying, what exactly are their symptoms? Because then we can treat them. And this need to generalize and say it's a cult, which therefore means that they're all the same, and they're not. They're not. It is the authoritarianism that is the nasty bit of it. You take orders that you want to be told what to do, and pushing away all of the extraneous material. When we define somebody a malignant narcissist, what's happened is a friend of mine a few years ago was accused, he's an ex-Scientologist, he was accused, in fact I can name him, Pete Griffiths. He was another ex-Scientologist, John Dignan, publicly called him a narcissist. And I objected. I said, we can't diagnose people without psychiatric qualification, and there's the Goldwater rule, we'd have to actually sit down. And so calling somebody that, I know Pete well. He's not a narcissist, he's an exhibitionist. He is somebody that likes attention, wears interesting clothes and wants to be the life of the party, life and soul of the party. And he is, he's a lovely guy. And I could see why John Dignan was really annoyed with him, because he'd made very overt sexual conversation at dinner and done things that were culturally unacceptable to John Dignan. But we get into this place where, as with just about every term in psychiatry, when somebody's called paranoid, he's paranoid. We don't mean that he is a diagnosable paranoid. We mean a bit over anxious, schizophrenic. The word mongoloid or mong entered the language and had to be banished very, very quickly. And in almost every case, this term is misunderstood. In the popular idea of the word schizophrenic is multiple personality disorder, which is not what the term means at all. Schizophrenic is not normal.
You said something that I think is very important, the cultural component.
Yeah. Because
I think the cultural component of any of these terms is often missed. We bring up the word narcissist. A long time ago, I had hair, and
and you weren't able to polish your head as beautifully as you can now.
Yeah. So I started losing my hair when I was 15. So it was a long time ago, and I was spending a lot of time combing my hair. My mother said, "You're a narcissist with the hair," And so from her,
and your mother was an actress, right?
My mother was an actress, yeah. So culturally, it was somebody spends too much time with hair. That's a little narcissistic, but it didn't mean I was a narcissist. So I think we have to always bring in this cultural component into these things. I had a conversation with Yuval the other day. I was interested in exploring this concept of it's a whole other subject, aphantasia, and but we drifted off into diagnoses, and he said that for some people, when they get a diagnosis from a psychiatrist, it's liberating, because it gives an explanation to why they are who they are, and for other people, it's stigmatizing. They think they'll never change because they're stuck in that place. So different people respond to different things in different ways. And I think that
it's worth interjecting at this point that the Dunedin study in New Zealand of 1,000 people born in, I think, 1972, there around, has shown very conclusively that people's psychiatric diagnosis changes with time. The whole Jungian idea of you're born with a certain personality, a certain temperament, and that is absolutely wrong. And so when you do get a label of any kind, if it is accurate and useful, then it can be a way of changing. So if somebody is diagnosed with borderline personality or narcissistic personality disorder, if they recognize that as true, which it may well not be, but if they recognize it as true, then they can transform, they can change the way they are. The extreme malignant narcissist, not much hope for them. But
I think that relates directly to the point of, the second gen folks who were born and raised in a community and now are doing extraordinary things. I know a number of these young people who are, at the tops of their fields, and they're not necessarily related to the helping professions, but they've done amazing things. And yet they still feel wounded. They still feel other than, they still feel left out of the larger culture, and, are seeking help for different issues.
Yes.
But the fact that it has been a change, they've been able to find the change, and make it happen, really on their own, self-reliant, without the help of and support of the family system.
We told about
if the family system is still involved in the group.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes the whole families have left.
Yeah.
Or, and yet the aftershock remains in those people. Yeah.
And I mean, one of the truisms of political culture is the idea that we've got to crack down on scroungers. You know, people who are living on welfare.
That's right.
They'll pass it on to the next generation.
Yeah.
But in fact, studies tend to show that if you've grown up in that kind of abject poverty, you will really work to do something different. I mean, there are places where it's not possible. You know, there are places where the Rust Belt in the US, for example, where there is no work, so the possibility isn't there. But very high achievers can come from backgrounds of destitution. And
there's a study just done, and I forgot what city it is in California. It's in Northern California, a poor city, and the mayor did an experiment giving, I forgot how many people, but let's say 200 people, $500 a month for a couple of years. And they wanted to find out, would $500 just enable these people not to work, or would it encourage them to work in some way? And what they found out, I forgot what percentage it was, but it was a significant percentage of the people, they left poverty because the $500 a month was enough so they could have a car fixed, or they could pay for childcare, and they could go out and apply for jobs. That little extra money was enough to change their lives. So, you know, we come to this often with a lot of prejudice about, especially in America, I think, about what the welfare system, keeping people entrenched. And maybe it does in some places, but there might be other approaches to it, like this mayor who came up with, let's find the people that $500 would make a change, who are still working, they have jobs. Can we find ways that they can take their kids to the hospital or the doctors, that they can pay someone to do it and stay at work?
Yeah, I mean, the studies of universal basic income in Alaska, in Finland, have shown that while it hasn't really changed the amount of people who are working, it has taken tremendous pressure off the health system, because as Yuval, you mentioned a few minutes ago, as Yuval says, the fundamental cause of depression is poverty. The fundamental cause of anxiety is poverty in our society. And it's perhaps why these conditions are not really found in what we call primitive or first societies. You know, you don't find depressed people in hunter-gatherer societies because everybody's integrated into the society and doing something. Whereas if you're just looking forward to bleak, you know, being accused of being a scrounger, being pushed down the social ladder all of the time, it can be a bit upsetting. And when you take those pressures off, then of course it's benefiting society financially, that less money has to be spent on you know, the poor in this situation.
This is where the doctrine of Ayn Rand and the objectivists, you know, it's just...
And what a dreadful human being she was, you know. Oh.
What has she added to the dialogue of helping others and becoming a better human society?
This idea of depression and anxiety and more primitive societies. Recently, I met a relative on Facebook who had she's taken the time of the pandemic, and she put together about a 60-page, book is not the word, history of a piece of my family. So it's my father's mother, her parents, my great-grandparents, who homesteaded in South Dakota in 1880. And they went there when there was no roads, there was nothing. They were just grass, you know, tall grass. And somehow, through true grit, they made it through. The fires, or they would have to put out the fires, it would come, the storms, these horrible things. There was no time for anxiety. There was no time for feeling down. Just was not an option because there were fires happening right now, because the fires came and burned the grass, and you needed to go out and put out the fires with water. You know, in the wintertime, there's a story of, was one horrible storm in the late 1800s, early 1900s in the 3 states. Most of the livestock died, and a lot of people died. But my great-grandparents tunneled from where the house, which was a sod house, through to where the cattle were, or the animals, and threw to the well and brought these animals, and they stayed alive. And so it was that sort of ingenuity, but there was no time for depression. There was no time for anxiety. And my father always would say that in some ways, and it relates to Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, that, these are high class problems. These are first world problems, he said, that we deal with because we're dealing with quality of life issues, not necessarily life and death issues. There's certainly life and death issues in the cult world, but a lot of times these are quality of life issues.
And it's not necessarily a society that's suffering privation. If you look at the Ba'aka Pygmy in Central Africa around the Congo, looking at film of them, the thing that always gets me, apart from them, of course, being quite small compared to other people because they're pygmies, but they seem to have a very happy life. They don't have a lot of stuff. In fact, one of the things that really got me, I got very interested in them about 30 years ago, and there wasn't very much material, so it was easy to study them back then. And there's this beautiful film of them out in the forest, and they're out wandering around at night, and they sit down and make camp. And one of them takes a leaf from a tree and pulls a strand across and tightens it, and has created a little guitar and starts playing this thing. And you see that these people are just engaged with the world around them. And, somebody's going, again, with the San, the so-called Bushmen of the Kalahari, I see that in them. And there's something very direct about the way they live. Seeing an old San guy teaching kids and thinking about what Western schools look like, which is kind of, that's about the excitement.
You got it.
And you look at the San guy teaching, and all the kids are going, because he's showing them, this is the ostrich, this is how the ostrich moves. You've got this integration. I was in Washington, D.C. many years ago, and I was a cab driver from Ghana, and he'd been in the country for 8 years. And I said, what do you think is the main difference? What strikes you as the main difference between being in Ghana and being in the US? And he said, well, in my village in Ghana, if anything went wrong, everybody in the village was there to help you. In the US, you have welfare. And there we are.
But that building relationships and knowing you can depend on your neighbors, and that requires you to interact and engage. You're not isolated.
We saw Joe.
The check isn't coming in the mail. You're having to go to your neighbor and say, hey, I'm in need, or the neighbor already knows and is bringing you the casserole.
Or you may have to drink goat's milk or something like that.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
We saw this in Northern Africa. Joe and I went many years ago to study a little about the Berber people.
Yeah.
This is sort of a kind of Islam where the women really are the ones who are the visionaries. When they do the trance dancing, the women have these visions. And it was sort of interesting to me, this culture. But we were on a train. It turns out Tunisia has a Berber population and the best train system in all of Africa. And we were on a train, and it stopped to some.
We were going from Tunis to the seaside resort, whose name escapes me. But have you been to Tunisia, John? Have you been to Tunisia? No.
No, I haven't been.
We're on the train, and we stopped at a stop, and on the train came this woman, a couple women that were completely covered with their children, and they got on the train, and immediately men got up, including Joe, and helped them put their luggage up. There was not an acknowledgement, a thank you. There was a subtle acknowledgement. And then the children were running up and down the aisles, and strange men would pick the kids up, put them on their lap.
But just put them next to them, pat them on the head. When the vendor came to sell candy, that stranger who didn't come together. They came on at different stops and didn't appear to know one another. Just engaged to take care of this child. The whole community was engaged. This little group. It was so impressive to me because it was just so natural, the interaction, and that craving for that kind of familiarity and comfort that cults offer, or purport to offer, at least at first gaze, at first glance, is what people crave often when they join up with various groups. And when
it was impressive to see how very tight societies that tend to be unicultural interact. And I think that but I think in my father coming from South Dakota, he was Irish Catholic and all the relatives were Irish Catholic, but it was mostly a German and Swedish communities. 100 miles square, 100 people, very few people. And so the Irish sort of culturally connected with each other, not so much with the other cultures. And they had their own strategies for dealing with different problems. And I was fascinated, and I've been researching a little bit. One of the problems, and I had no idea that they had in the late 1800s, were gypsies. And we can't find if these were Roma gypsies or Irish travelers. But they were gypsies that would come in caravans. And when they stopped at my great grandmother's farm, what they would often do is the women would go up to the house to buy eggs or chickens, something like that, and determine if there were any men around. And if there were not, it was determined, then the men would go and steal the implements and what they could do. So my great grandmother, when she saw the gypsies coming, and they had a system of announcing this to the other farmers, she got a stick and had it tied a red handkerchief on it and waved it, which meant there was smallpox on this farm, and they would just go on. So these people had to identify, this small group of people, a way in handling a situation culturally that didn't, it gave one person a tremendous amount of power, my grandmother, a great grandmother, with a stick and a flag, because she understood another culture and she understood her own culture and how can I handle this situation.
And it didn't require weapons.
In
the US of A.
Yeah, it makes me think about Thomas Berger and the great novelist and Little Big Man, that astonishing story where one of the things that I read a fair amount about the Plains Indians, the Cheyenne, the Lakota, and particularly the Ponca. I wrote about the Ponca who nested between them, and they're agricultural people who had to fight them off twice a year, and did what they did. But some of the things in that culture, which you see in Little Big Man, like the reverse man who has to ride backwards and washes himself with dirt and all of that, that is real. That did happen. But also the transvestite who becomes a bride, one of the squaw brides, that happened as well, was perfectly accepted. So what? So different from our culture and the way we're meant to be. But there's this other thing that if you wanted to get your wagon train across their land, and that was somewhat contentious from the gold rush of 1849 onward, then the best thing to do is to pretend to be a lunatic, because they're terrified of lunacy. And so somebody going, "Oh!" like that at you. I mean, George Melly, who was an English jazz singer, said that as a member of the surrealist profession, that when anybody sort of backed him into an alley to rob him, he would say, "And the sky rained knives and forks at them," and they'd run. So, I love the little red wagon. That's great. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that.
I'll, if you're interested, I'll forward you this pamphlet book.
Oh, please do. Please.
It's filled with just amazing stories that were handed on, and there's two sections. In one section, I found to me amazing. My father's cousin. This farm has been passed in our family for generation after generation, and he wrote to his infant grandson a letter to tell his infant grandson where he came from, who he was, and the importance of where he's been. And he passed on this story in the way he would speak. Yeah. It's interesting. I'll send it on to you.
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great. I mean, a few months ago, I finished reading The Living by Annie Dillard, which is about the Northwest from 1850 to about 1890. And because she's the greatest writer of prose of the generation. Annie Proulx's, I think, the only person I know who can compete with her. Just astonishing prose writing, and she's so insightful. But her history is that good. She's researched it, she's worked it out, and you find out these amazing things which are not relevant to our conversation at all. For example, the xenophobe movement in the 1880s in the US. In 1885, immigration of Chinese was forbidden by law in the US because there were too many of them, because they'd been brought in to build the railroad, and thousands of them had been massacred because there were no health and safety regulations. And she goes into that and shows that, in fact, the socialist movement in the US became part of the xenophobe movement. They were all for, beating these people up and sending them to San Francisco to get them put back. They called them the Celestials. That, of course, leads to the prohibition of opium, which is nothing to do with the drug war, but it's what leads to the drug war, because they want, by banning smoking opium, but not laudanum or heroin or morphine or any codeine, any of the many other opiates, the much stronger ones, they only ban the weaker one, because the Chinese smoke it and they want to get rid of them. And that leads to the Harrison Act and every the carnage with opioids.
Well, it's fascinating.
No,
I've not known. I'm running up against a wall of time.
Great.
It was good to see you.
Yeah, always. And we'll meet again soon, I hope.
Right. Cheers.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
And the sky rained knives and forks.